Hello and welcome. My name is Christopher Haritatos. I'm co-director of Publick Musick. I'm here with Boel Gidholm, the other co-director of Publick Musick. I'm a cellist. Boel is a violinist, and we are here with two very special guests who are joining us from all around the world. Professor Greta Haenen, who is a retired professor of musicology at the Akademie für Alte Musik Bremen, part of the Hochschule für Künste in the area of early music, and Edoardo Bellotti, who is currently a professor of organ at the same institution of higher education. So we are here to give a little, I would normally say a pre-concert talk, a virtual pre-concert talk, except the concert actually happened 3 years ago. So it's a pre-recording discussion about this cantata by Bernardo Pasquini that we performed 3 years ago, S'aprirono I Cieli. And Edoardo, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Pasquini?
Yeah, very glad to be part of this discussion together and to be back shortly. Yeah, Pasquini was a very interesting composer and in some way was a little bit unlucky because was so famous and so well known in his time and then was forgotten. His music was for a long period lost. He was very famous in his time as a teacher. He had students coming from all Europe to study keyboard music with him, but he was also very famous working in Rome as composer of cantatas, oratorios, and operas. And as I say, unfortunately, his music was lost or in some way was disseminated in many different countries and different collections. And only recently, for example, the keyboard composition were entirely published in a critical edition, and some of the oratorios are also available. And recently, the entire collection of his solo cantatas was also published in a very well done critical edition. So was so important in his time as well as forgotten for a long period. And now we are rediscovering this personality. We know he was from Massa Val di Nievole, a little village in Tuscany, and then he moved to Rome. And in Rome, he got very important position as organist and cembalist in several churches and at the service of several important personalities of the time, cardinals and noble members of Roman family. And of course, in his time, Rome was very interesting, was very rich for many reasons. And the keyboard music tradition established by Girolamo Frescobaldi was still present there. And Pasquini, in some way, was the personality who took the tradition of Frescobaldi and carried this tradition through the late 17th century.
All right.
Yes, and I have to thank you also, Edoardo, for leading us on to finding this cantata, this beautiful solo cantata. We were looking in Groves, and just speaking of his being slightly forgotten, there's a paragraph about his vocal music, and there's a mention of the solo cantatas. It says, there are also cantatas, arias, and solo motets.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. This is very pure. We must say we are happy because a few years ago, I think in 2016, finally, Arnaldo Morelli, who is a musicologist, Italian musicologist, published finally the first big, very well organized biography of Pasquini with the title La Virtù in Corte. And this is a very interesting book also because there are many chapters related to his vocal production. And this is very important because everybody mentioned him as a keyboard player, a good virtuoso and a good teacher, and not very much about this part of his activity. Of course, we know, everybody knows him as a keyboard player because he had very famous students with him, like Johann Caspar Kerl, Georg Muffan, Nicholas Adam Strung, so many German personality. And then the curiosity is also, if you look at the new critical edition, everything is reported in the edition as in the manuscript, the two main manuscripts that are mostly autographed by Pasquini. One is in Berlin and one is in London. And in this manuscript, there are a lot of names. Toccata per lo scozzese, partite per Petronilla, variazioni per il Paggio tedesco. Arnaldo Morelli recognize some of this personality. But if you go through the music, you have almost 100 names of people who were pupils of Pasquini, which means how famous it was in his time. But again, the side of the cantatas oratorios, sadly, was a little bit forgotten, and still now is not very often performed. There are some recordings, there are some performances like Publick Musick, this Christmas cantata. There was a performance in a festival in Krakow, in Poland, a few years ago on a Holy Friday cantata by Pasquini, La Sete di Cristo. And this was enormously successful because nobody knew this composer, and they discovered the high quality of his music.
Perhaps it would be interesting to look at the environment in which Pasquini was working and composing these cantatas and his other vocal music.
Yeah, I think Greta also can say a lot.
Okay, yeah.
You started with the environment because he's the one who works with all with the high nobility in Rome, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I tried to get him to work in Vienna, but he didn't go. There is actually quite a lot of he must have had in his private library, he must have had quite a lot of vocal music by Pasquini. There are a few cantatas, I think, and there is Sant'Agnese in a beautiful manuscript. And he was in high esteem. And I think it's not only the question that he worked with nobility. You have all those pupils, and they are among the finest composers of the generation slightly after him. And it's strange that he is so forgotten. Has anybody ever heard an opera by Pasquini?
I was wondering about that.
No idea.
That's a very
I would like to hear it, because you can see in his cantata that he knows the way of how to compose an opera. If you look at a Bach cantata, I mean, but sacred music, you can easily see that if Bach would have composed an opera, that it would have been a disaster. Whereas if you look at Pasquini works, you can easily think him as an opera composer, even in Rome, where it was a little bit more difficult, I think, to come to opera. They kind of got more cantata and serenate and then a little bit of oratorio. And if the Pope wasn't against it, and if you were private enough, you could do opera.
Yeah, officially operas were forbidden in Rome, of course, by the Pope, as well as some representation with theme subject that were not taken from Bible, from liturgical occasion. This was officially. Then we know that unofficially there were also other events in the time. As officially, also alchemic researches were forbidden, but the most of the cardinals had their own alchemic center with researchers. So this was what happened in Rome in the time. Many things were officially forbidden, but many things were always under table, organized very, very often. I think one of the interesting things that happened in the life of Pasquini was the arrival in Rome of the Queen Christine from Sweden. And she established an academia, and in this academia, Pasquini was a member, Corelli was a member, so the best composer and architects and artists and poets of the time were a member of this academy. And this was a great occasion. I want to quote another German who was in the time in Rome, who was Athanasius Kircher, and he was also with a high reputation, one of the consultants of the activity of Gian Lorenzo Bernini as an architect and sculptor in Rome in the time. And he published also this huge book, the Musurgia Universalis in 1650, where you find a lot of information about the Roma activity. Of course, Pasquini arrived 15, 20 years later, but in any case, Kircher was still there, was still alive until the 80s. So there were contacts in this very, very exciting congregation of peoples and artists of the time. But for sure, Christina had a very important role because what we know also in the development of this academy when Christina died was the so-called Accademia d'Arcadia. And for the Italian history of literature and also fine art, this represented the going away from Baroque and try to reestablish a kind of more essential classic organization. And this is the reason why, in some way, Pasquini sounds for me very, very traditional. His music is not tonal, but it's still strongly related to the modal system of the 17th century. But if you compare, for example, his colleague and friend, Arcangelo Corelli, in Corelli, the direction of the music is totally new, totally different, with a simplification of the contrapuntal texture with advantage of the melodic cantabile line of each instrument. So it's very interesting. Pasquini is in the middle of this big change in the Italian culture between the second half of the 17th century and the early 18th century. But he sounds very often very traditional. I sometimes compare with Bach in the last part of his life that was accused to be too much old-fashioned. No? And in some way, Pasquini was in this way. But of course, is not completely in this way, because in his vocal music it's very clear that he was also very open and interesting in innovation through the vocality, particularly the texture of the singer and the expression of the singer part, the vocal parts.
Yes. To be a fly on the wall at that time. So where do you think a cantata like this would have been performed? In what context? Was it at Queen Christina's or a patron, or would there have been a public performance?
Generally, I don't know. I think Greta can say something more. I can only say, for what we know, I read in the book of Arnaldo Morelli, is that basically each noble personality or cardinal in Rome had his own building, and his building there were always a space to make music. And so we can expect that this music was not public in the sense that was, for example, in other in Venice with the theaters and something like that, but was more for a private public. But in some way, this private public could be very small, could be very large, according to guest people coming from everywhere to visit Rome.
Yes.
Yeah, basically you are invited, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say it's an entertainment for the nobility, because normal people would never have the chance. There is the thing with Ruspoli a bit later, but that's a political idea of inviting everybody, where the question is who is everybody, and that you get in for free. But it's still sort of something like I invite people, and in that respect, it's the same thing. You have on another scale, maybe with only the nobility, with the public for a cantata like Queenie's. They are not printed, for instance. It's really private. And even something like a Christmas cantata, it's not church music. It's music for the chamber, basically. So the idea of having a harpsichord would be absolutely true. The idea of having a female singer wouldn't be such a problem, I think. Of course, it's forbidden, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And the idea of having it as sort of as a noble entertainment, and it works along the normal cantata kind of composition, with maybe sort of the exception that it is not the simple one. You get cantatas for different occasions, actually. Let's leave out the serenata, but you have just the simplest way is having a soprano voice. Basically, most cantatas are soprano, having a soprano voice and a continuo player. And that's the basic cantata. And the basic cantata for professional singers. I wouldn't say there's a big difference between the secular and the sacred cantatas if they are not for the church. And as a matter of fact, if it's a bit more important, it gets a sinfonia and at least 2 violins. And that's sort of the higher bit of a cantata. If you have an academic cantata, you would probably also tend to have more than one voice and more than only a harpsichord. You would have something in a soprano other part. I mean, an instrumental soprano other part. And that's what you see here. You have sort of an orchestra. Well, no, not an orchestra. You have a few violins, as it were. And you have an ensemble. And that's to me, that sounds very much like 17th century. You have very strange kind of poetry. If you compare that to the later Arcadians, it's a bit strange. I know Pasquini was admitted there, but only towards the end of his life. And I think that was a time where he already had stopped writing cantatas. This one sounds to me like something between the later 70s and maybe around the 80s, but it doesn't sound much later, I would say. And you can still see the second aria is the only thing which says that it's an aria. And if you look at the poetry, you have recitatives that are sort of wild. I mean, it's from the point of view of the guy who writes the text. You have wild recitatives. And then you have sort of those very simple things with not many syllables, and that's the aria bits. But the first thing he has as an aria is kind of, I would say it comes, to me, it comes closer to something like between a cavata and an aria. And it doesn't say aria at all. The second one says aria, and what you see is typical also for opera arias of the later third of the 17th century, that you get a soprano voice, or bass or tenor, but in this case you get a soprano voice and a continuo player who has to be quite inventive. And well, he proposes nice continuo lines. That's something you have to admit. And then when the singer stops singing, you get a ritornello. And the ritornello actually shapes the cantata or shapes the aria. And if you go after this one, the second aria with ritornelli, you end up in something which, if you look at the text, is something like a very long kind of recitative without end. And that's something he really shapes, and you see where he goes into these slower triple times that you see sort of. I think there might be something like an influence by Cesti, who sometimes has the same way of composing and moving. What you see too is when you have a real Arcadia work, you have somebody who has recitative, which is blah 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 blah. And if you look at the recitatives in this cantata, what you see is there are outbursts of melismas. There is something which goes towards arioso. Then you have in the middle of the last recitative, you have this idea of these triple times, which are, I wouldn't say, neither recitative, nor arioso, nor cavata. I don't know how to call them, but in a way it reminds me of Handel's operas. If you think of the big accompagnati in Handel's opera, you have an English public. The audience doesn't understand a single word of Italian. And then you have all those recitatives nobody understands. So every now and then, Handel, being clever, puts in those big accompagnati, things like Alma del Gran Pompeo in Giulio Cesare, also, which has a status which comes near to the aria. There's a version actually of Giulio Cesare, that's why I took the example. There's a version for 2 recorders, must sound horrible. And it has only the arias, of course, and the accompagnati. This Alma del Gran Pompeo, for instance, is set for 2 recorders. And you see a little bit of this with Pasquini, I guess, Handel having been in Rome. And there's quite a lot of 17th century music in Handel. And he might well have seen what you can do with music like Pasquini's, and really with a little bit of a good knowledge of continuo playing and of counterpoint in composition. It's not this vertical. It's really it's super music, actually. By the way, I really enjoyed it here in listening to it. And what should I say? The basic idea, if you write a vocal piece, any kind of vocal piece, is that what Monteverdi said. The text is the master, and music has to follow it. And so the kind of text generates your cantata. So you need this sort of irregular sort of sentences to be able to write a recitative. And without a recitative, you don't have cantata. It's as easy as that. And what I really like, I mean, now I get personal, what I really like in it is this idea that you aren't yet in listening to one of those cliche cantatas, recitative aria, recitative aria, recitative aria. Yeah, I know, I'm 17th century, but that even the aria is not the usual, what you would expect, ABA da capo aria. You get these kind of more strophic forms. You get the ritornello bits which shape it, and you have another thing which to me is very 17th century and comes from opera, I think. Look at the lines and look what the singer does. When you have a singer, and I say 2 violins, viola, and a cello, as it were, and well, the guy who plays the keyboard is there always, but the string players basically play when the singer stops, and every now and then there's a little bit of do you say overlap?
Overlap.
But there's a little bit of where they get together, but in fact, the idea of having somebody singing and at the same moment there is violin playing very high and interworking with the singer isn't very 17th century. And I really like this idea of that you can really hear the words. And if you're Italian, you can really understand the words, and it's sort of a strange text. So you have to, you really have to listen, and it gives you the impression. And then you have those slower 3-2 movements, where you have something like the accompagnato, where the string players are doing easy things so as to just help out the singer. It's a bit like in the St. Matthew Passion, when you have these Christ recitatives always with sort of the holy, yeah. Well, is that something you can...
halo around the character of Jesus. Yes.
Sort of. But it's still a little bit unclassic. That makes it so nice.
Yeah.
I think I had the opportunity to listen to other cantatas and opera by Pasquini, include the Mosè, which is, of course, a kind of oratorio, and is in the same interesting situation. He was exploring more than one possibility. Also in the Moses, you find this kind of recitativo. Everything follow the text. You can find in the Moses a couple of situations where you have the kind of aria con il da capo. We don't know exactly who invented 100% this, but in the time, in the late 17th century, in Rome, there was also Alessandro Scarlatti as well in the early 18th century, in the last year of Pasquini, and the Moses is a little bit later. And probably Scarlatti was already exploring different way of shaping the aria and the recitativo. But in Pasquini, you never find a cliché. There is always something different. And as a keyboard player, for me, it's very interesting what happened, for example, in his toccatas. Each toccata is different. There is no way to understand the cliché, and he followed more or less the same ideas in each toccata. You don't know what happened in the following toccata. Each toccata is absolutely different, and he explores different way of shaping music according to different emotion. In some way was what Frescobaldi did, and what the Frescobaldi generation, include Monteverdi, did. And Pasquini looks like he is very interesting in continuing this 17th century tradition, but meantime he's also very, very interesting in understanding what is going on and the new things that happen around him.
Yes. Yes, that's what I like. That something is it's like that last recitative before the aria. That it is not a simple recitative, and you wouldn't expect suddenly that he goes into something which, for a few bars, is completely different. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love the unexpected in his work. Yeah.
And you talked a little about the text, and I know, Edoardo, you've been working a little on the translation here, which is not a simple thing. It's a very convoluted text. I don't think it's known who wrote this text.
No, I think this is one of the problems of the time, that each personality in Rome was a little bit amateur in this sense and wrote. And of course, the cliché of the writing was this Baroque cliché of the meraviglia, the wonder, the surprise, the contrasting element, the complexity. So you read 10 lines of text without understanding anything, and then you reach the final line, and okay, everything goes in order. So it's this kind of surprising Baroque idea. You find the same when you enter a church in Rome in the same time, church built by Bernini or Borromini, this huge Baroque church, where you go in and you have a lot of decoration and you get a little bit confused. The only way to understand what is going on, you cannot stay and admire, but you have to walk through, and only walking through the monument, you understand what is going on. And in some way, the same idea in the music. You cannot look at the music and from outside find kind of symmetry, some regularity, you have to play through or to listen to, and then only at the end you understand. And the same with the text. I must say there are a couple of moments where I didn't yet find a good solution also for the translation. So the meaning is very clear, but this contrast and this sometimes putting together words also not very commonly used to create a little bit of surprise is typical of this text. So we understand the general meaning. We understand the contrast always present in the Christmas text of the time. Christmas is happy, the baby is born, and here and there, but meantime, the baby is also the big personality. The baby is also the one who will go on the cross. So this kind of contrasting element, it create always the kind of tension inside the music, and Pasquini, as Greta said, follow very well this kind of tension. We have a lot of texts of the time, very often without the name of the composer. This is for Pasquini, this is in general for the music of the time, and in Rome particularly, we have a lot of also of Latin text. This is also even more curious, motets or cantatas related to festivity, and you don't know where the Latin texts come from. And of course, it's a little not very much classic, not very much correct. And sometimes I say, well, probably the verger or the church custodian wrote the text, and then the musician took the text and arranged the music. But in this case, I cannot say the text is a low quality. It's quite complex, is quite difficult, but the ingredients are this contrasting element, this hyperbole with big emphasis in many words. And of course, this is the paradise for the composer if the composer doesn't impose to the text a prepared scheme, but like Pasquini, try to follow word by word the meaning of the text. And I found this is what happened exactly in this beautiful cantata.
But the texts are many a time, the texts are sort of, the texts of cantatas in that time are sort of, you don't understand what is happening. And you have all those popes and nobles who write poetry. I mean, starting with, I think, Barberini even wrote Greek poetry. And then he had composers setting it, because he was a music lover, and he expected them to do so. And you have, I think, Clemente the Ninth, and you have the two Alexanders, 7 and 8, who also wrote poetry. And at least Rospigliosi wrote sort of opera libretti. So yeah, and it's always, I mean, if you look at the idea of a noble entertainment, I guess there are sort of meanings that are only to be understood by the happy few in that time, and that makes it, of course, more difficult for us to know what it's all about. I mean, if you have a cantata like this one, you know, okay, it's about Christmas, and sometimes it's not really bad poetry, but sometimes it's a bit strange in his. It exaggerates. The giant baby is something like, well,
yeah, that is a little bit of a strange passage in the
yeah.
Or this contrast.
But it works with this kind of contrast.
Yeah, with the cuna and the croce. No, your cradle is a cross for sin, your cross a cradle for faith. So this contrasting element. Of course, they are very interesting in the field of poetry. Probably are a little bit too much. We can say today a little bit kitsch. But in the time, the kitsch was also good. Was the kitsch of the time? This, and in some way was also this idea of the freedom in creating as much as possible a new game of contrasting words together. And this was typical of the Baroque time. I like to remember Athanasius Kircher, because I am very interested, particularly in this German guy and theorist and intellectual who worked in Rome in the time. And when I think in 2002 or 2003, there was an exhibition in Rome because it was an anniversary of Kircher, Umberto Eco, the Italian writers and expert of semiology, wrote the article for the presentation of the exhibition. And at the end, he wrote that, of course, Kircher was a real Baroque man in many, and he was interested in many things, but he was always not totally happy in his life, because it looks like he was unhappy for two reasons. Because the fantasy was not enough scientific, and science was not enough fantastic. And so this contrast between the rules and the fantasy, the creativity, was a conflict, a permanent conflict. And we found in some way this permanent conflict also in literature in the time, the way of writing, in the exaggeration sometimes for us, 21st century people, exaggeration in the text. Last thing I remember, because if you go to Rome, you have to visit Palazzo Borghese, because he worked a lot for the family Borghese, and he had a room in the building, in the side building, and it's very nice. And we know that he probably used very often for this private entertainment, cantatas and oratorios, the claviorganum. So this instrument, it was an harpsichord and an organ together, which offered the possibility to have a more variety in the sound, in the colors, and in the texture of the continuo. Because you can have rhythmical shaping element and arpeggio with the cembalo. You can have more polyphonic, contrapuntal accompaniment when you play the organ. So it looks like in the time of Pasquini, the claviorganum in Rome was one of the favorite instruments to perform music. And he was probably player, and he played this instrument in the Palazzo Borghese.
That's interesting, because now you see why Muffat and Carol and so on went to learn with Pasquini, because at the court in Vienna they had claviorgan too, and they were used everywhere. I mean, you have operas with claviorganum, you have oratorio with claviorganum, and sometimes you can see in the score that it's indicated cembalo, claviorgano, and or lute. Also, it's very interesting how they shape the continuo, and I guess they have it from Rome, because that's the influence in Vienna. Super instrument.
Yeah. Well, this has been really interesting, and as convoluted, perhaps to our 21st century minds, the text might be. I find, at least, that the music, at least, is sort of immediately appealing and accessible. So it's Thank you both for joining us for this conversation, and now we can listen to the performance of this cantata.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amen.